I am Simon Rabinovitch, U.S. economics editor with The Economist. For this panel, we are going to be discussing open technology, data, security, and possibly a few other things thrown in as well. With me, starting from furthest to the left, we have Laurie Richardson, who's Vice President of Google, Chris Meserole, Director of AI and the Emerging Tech Initiative at Brookings, and Bruce Andrews, Chief Government Affairs Officer for Intel. So I have to admit that open technology, open versus closed, was something that I wasn't entirely sure what exactly that meant, and there's many, many different rival definitions out there. But I think with reference to our discussion focused on AI today, I think one of the ways that we can look at it is this infatuation in the tech world with things being open to spur more and more innovation, potentially from the government side, a desire for greater transparency, but weighed against the risks with new emerging technologies where openness could actually lead to things falling into bad actors' hands, could potentially be negative for innovation as well. So with that in mind, I thought it would be useful to hear from the experts how they understand open versus closed, what it means for their companies, for their view of industry, starting with you, Laurie.
Thanks, Simon. It's really nice to be here. And I think this is such an important topic. So let me start by just giving a little bit of context about the role that I play at Google. I work closely with Kent. I'm on his team. But I lead a large team called Trust and Safety. And it's a team, a global team of professionals who write policies for all of Google products, Google Search, Google Ads, Maps, basically everything you interact with on Google. The team is thinking about what are the safeguards and guardrails to put in place so that these products can be used safely and so that we can address different forms of abuse. And we also enforce those policies. And so I'm coming to the conversation from a unique vantage point because it's a field that has existed for some time within the technology industry, but we are facing a really new moment, and we are all obsessively thinking and talking about it and engaged in it in our day-to-day work. From where I sit, we are thinking about AI in really three different ways. We are front lines of shaping exactly how the technology, the applications that Google is launching are going to work. So we're helping train and test and set policies for and respond to use cases that we didn't anticipate for our AI launches. We are also preparing for global elections. We're the team that oversees global elections, so we're preparing for a potential new wave of scaled abuse. Not necessarily novel forms of abuse. We don't think we're going to see things we've never seen before, but we think they might be enabled at a scale that really tests the boundaries of how we have approached enforcement in the past. And we're also an industry that itself will be transformed by AI. So part of my day job is thinking about how AI will change the nature of the work of my team and how we may use it to do tasks or to expand our coverage of surfaces that we weren't able to get to before with past technology. We, of course, already use AI. We use classifiers, as Kent said, the YouTube statistic that he used, 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000 policy-violating videos. But we do think the potential that we're sitting on top of is huge. So that's a big mouthful, but that's my team and what we do. Coming back to the question of open and closed, it's such a fascinating binary. And it's a time when I think we are having to test and think about a lot of our assumptions and the way that we've thought about things for a long time and see them through this new lens of what's now possible with technology and wonder if we should be thinking about it a little bit differently. As Simon alluded to, this sort of belief in openness is of open source technology, of research that is open, of transparency is deeply embedded in Silicon Valley culture, and the internet is really a reflection of a set of beliefs and governance structures that really are to their core open. And Google is full of passionate engineers who really believe in openness. And our platforms and products are built for everyone and are really in default toward openness. Android is a platform that anyone can build on. Google Search was meant to organize the world's information and make it universally useful and accessible, and those are really noble and important goals. When it comes to AI, we are seeing this moment where we're thinking a lot about, and the public conversation that's happening right now is so important. Where are the limits of where openness where is it competing with safety and national security? And so even over just the last few months. We watched the conversation evolve from a place where it seemed like maybe just a few small companies were really going to dominate the space to becoming a lot more curious about what's possible from the open source community and what smaller groups, companies, researchers, individuals can be capable of in terms of the applications and uses and sort of how they might train and gear various forms of the technology towards certain ends. So it's a question of whether you view lots and lots of people being able to use and apply this technology as an expansion of opportunity, which I think it is, or as an expansion of risk, which I think it also is. And that's why we're sort of all urgently participating in this conversation about the right way to think about this, about the right guardrails to put into place. I'll pause there, but that's just sort of an opening bit on how I think about this theme.
Okay. Just to throw it right back at you for a second, though, I mean, as you said, it's a binary, which obviously at a certain level is always going to be somewhat false in terms of a harsh dichotomy. But what do you think is the right way to think about that balance between risk and potential?
I think we have to anchor a lot on the notion of accountability to start with. And so I think it is important, and we have started to think about what form this really should take. But for the large companies that are developing frontier models to be tested by external researchers, people from civil society, governments where appropriate, tested for safety, to really be able to provide the right amount of transparency. And we should come back to that notion because explainability is something that we should unpack and understand better when it comes to AI, what's possible and what's desirable. But I think there is a really, really important anchor that we all need to start with, where no matter who's developing technology, there should be some level of accountability and transparency built in. And let me just take one specific example. The previous panel talked a little bit about university and researcher access to enough compute to actually be able to engage in and test these models. I think that's really important, and it's a problem that we need to work together to solve, because the private sector should not be creating in a vacuum, and I don't think governments are the best situated actually to be the sole sort of testers and those who are going to form the notions of where the bounds should be. So we need to make sure that researchers and academics, who really are the source of incredible American innovation, will be able to have access to and engage in these systems. And that's a combination of open and closed.
Thank you. Chris, can I ask, because you're responsible not just for looking at AI, but for emerging technologies more broadly, when you think about this open versus closed question, does AI look specifically different to you?
It does now. I would say, I would reframe, just to start off with, I would reframe or build on Laurie's comments earlier to say that I see kind of, over the course of my lifetime, this conversation of open versus closed has really had three different frames to it. When I was a kid, I was a Linux kid, right? Like one of the highly, achievements of my adolescence was not just getting Linux, but getting it to work on my computer, right? It was open source. This was the future. This is kind of how technology should be developed. At that point in time, open versus closed was really, it was a cultural issue. To some extent, it was a business model issue, but that was really the extent of the debate. Then maybe 5-10 years ago, as some of the risks of the internet kind of began to percolate through society, or some of the impacts of it did, the conversation shifted a little bit. Now open versus closed meant, well, maybe we should have a little bit more transparency into what these systems are doing, right? And that was kind of a big part of the conversation the last few years, was really looking at how open these should be, especially to the public and to policymakers who are tasked with governing them. What has changed now is that I would say from now and going forward indefinitely, this issue of open versus closed, in my view, will be the defining issue of a lot of these AI policy debates, because it is run headlong into the national security concerns of major states, including, and especially the United States. These models are becoming capable enough that, and powerful enough that what we think of as a chat app, the actual kind of logic underneath them, and as we continue to scale out the compute and data that goes into them, if they continue improving exponentially as they have, they're going to have capabilities that have profound national security implications. There's a lot of policymakers who are aware of that, and I think the question now is, how do we harness kind of the benefits of the openness that have gotten us to this point, and innovating to these incredible new systems that we have, with what are going to be some really significant national security concerns raised about the prospect of these kind of models proliferating widely, which they will do if we have the same kind of open model that we've had in the past. So there's going to be a real push to kind of lock them down and create more of a closed ecosystem than we've had before, which is, I think it's a very reasonable debate that we're going to have, but it is going to clash headlong with the kind of culture of the developers who've been producing these models, the open source, not necessarily open sourcing the actual algorithm, but researchers at the cutting edge of AI, for example. For a long time, you make your career by publishing your papers, right? We're reaching a point where I'm not sure that that's going to be viable from a national security perspective. And it's going to have massive implications, I think, for how AI is developed and what the culture is that goes into it. So that AI, I think, is different in that regard in terms of how it's been developed compared to other things like the internet, and the capabilities that it's now acquiring and are kind of rapidly accelerating. Certainly have the last few years, and I think there's every reason to believe they'll continue to accelerate in the years to come.
Can I ask, you've arrived at that conclusion sitting within the Brookings institution here in DC. Do you get the sense that you'd be able to sell Silicon Valley on kind of that view of national security, and how do you make that sales pitch?
Well, first of all, I should clarify, this is not necessarily my view. I am just trying to parrot what I'm hearing in different conversations, and the sales pitch is going to be very hard. The reality, though, is that on the national security side, there's certain things the government can do that it's no longer a sales question. It's going to happen because we're putting out these administrative instruments. We are kind of regulated in a certain fashion, and if the tech industry isn't comfortable with that, it's not really up to the tech industry for some of this. I'm not saying that that's the way it should be. I'm just saying that's one of my concerns going forward is the kind of approach that we've had over the last 30 years and how we're developing technology. It has been largely divorced from national security implications. Maybe you could kind of say in the 90s around some of the debates around cryptography and the crypto wars we had then, or maybe the closest kind of parallel to what we're about to go through with AI. But it's, to some extent, it's not even a sales pitch. I think it's going to be a set of conversations that the national security establishment and the tech sector need to have in tandem about how to maturely and responsibly balance the trade-offs between an open and closed model.
Bruce, can we jump to the regulatory front for a second?
Sure.
You're fresh from dropping, I think, $30 billion or so in Germany after spending $100 billion in Ohio, and you're all over the place right now. I gather in Europe, of course, they're ahead of the game, if you will, in terms of regulation of AI. What was the sense that you got there in terms of how they're thinking about regulation and how they're thinking about what America is thinking about regulation?
Sure. Yeah. I'm literally fresh off the plane yesterday, so it is particularly fresh. But look, I think the Europeans have a theocratic difference with how we do it in the United States, right? Their view is to regulate upfront and sort of set a set of rules, which of course, that if you don't calibrate it exactly right, has the ability to really restrict innovation. And finding the balance between allowing innovation, protecting national security, but doing it in a way that doesn't inhibit the ability of an industry to both develop and be successful and have these technologies take off. And so I do think talking to the Europeans, they feel quite strongly that they think the United States has missed in the past. And particularly, I think, and I'll tell you from serving as the Deputy Secretary of the Commerce Department and working particularly on privacy, during that time, we would go to other countries and we would say, hey, here is the reason that maybe you don't want to adopt GDPR, you should do another model. What we got was, you don't really have a model. And until the world is watching right now, there is a huge amount of interest. And frankly, because the United States tends to lead in innovation, and it's much easier to build a company to scale in the United States than it is in Europe. So on one level, it's easier for them to regulate, right? Because they don't have as flourishing of a innovation ecosystem, and particularly, a lot of European companies as they grow are basically told you have to move to the United States because of the capital markets, because of the regulatory structure. And that has created a lot of challenges and issues with the Europeans. So I think they think they're doing the right thing because they look at what the potential is for AI. They're very concerned. And so they're essentially trying to get out of the box and set what will become the global standard, right? If the United States doesn't have a model, other countries will look at it and they will adopt it. And as a company that does the enabling technology, it's essentially what we do at Intel, right? We build the chips that help power all this stuff, whether it's having more computing power, which obviously AI is going to require a massive amount of computing power, or the other technologies that are related, whether it's healthcare, whether it's 5G, whether it's supercomputing. We do have a real concern of making sure this is done in the right way. That there are legitimate issues, and I think to your point, Chris, having that public-private discussion. One of the things that we prided ourselves on when I was at Commerce is really engaging in stakeholder dialogues and bringing the private sector in, trying to find an outcome that everybody can agree on. And I think that's going to be very important because, frankly, we're in the first inning of the game here, right? People don't know where these technologies are going. I don't think we really understand it, and so making sure we find the right balance, and also recognizing, and the Europeans will say this, I've had them be very blunt about it, which is, oh, you didn't take action when we did GDPR, and now you're not really able to do privacy and legislation or some kind of privacy protections at a national level. So finding that balance and having the discussion here in Washington and, legislating, frankly, in what is a remarkably challenging congressional environment will create a whole its whole set of strategies. And then you add in the national security component, which we're particularly sensitive to the extent that the semiconductor industry, we're a global industry. Chinese market is a big chunk of every semiconductor company and makes it very difficult to be successful. And you also see the administration looking and saying, how do we stop these technologies from going to China? Because they could be used for the development of AI as well. And so finding that balance there as well, because of the particularly large impact it could have on the global leading companies, presents real challenges.
Okay.
Simon, can I just quickly build on that and make one point, which is I think the fact that we are having this conversation at the stage that we're in and how the early days of real innovation coming out of generative AI in so many ways is a sign that I think companies and governments and civil society and universities have deeply actually internalized some of the lessons of the social media era. That's sort of a line that people are using. We can't make the same set of mistakes again that we made back then. We have to do it differently. I think there's a lot of evidence it is happening in a different way already. And you see the G7 starting to become active. Companies went to the White House and asked for a meeting and are starting to develop ways of thinking about norms that we might come out with even before legislation really actually makes sense because there's so much that we still don't know. And there are lots of deep discussions already happening. As a trust and safety professional, it's pretty amazing to have the company that I work at brand itself around responsibility and boldness right out of the gate. And it actually means that the seat at the table that we've long had with products as they develop, but actually is different. It's more empowered than it even has been in the past. And so really being able to co-create with responsibility in mind at the outset and with there's innovation happening in partnership models and the way to work with governments and the right way to regulate. That's all pretty encouraging.
Can I ask Chris, Congressman Liu talked about the idea of creating a commission before getting down to the work of legislation. Do you think is that a constructive idea? Would that yield something that would potentially, create a pathway towards good bills?
I'm going to say yes, but in the sense that I think eventually we need to actually do things, and we've had a number of commissions over the last few years. There's a lot of different bodies looking at advisory groups, et cetera. Eventually, we're going to have to act. But in the case of the commission that Congressman Liu put forward, I think it's a very reasonable one. It's going to fill in some gaps. I would encourage everybody to go kind of read the proposal that he put forth. It's really, I think, an exercise in many ways at trying to map out what the actual risks are that are new, what we have adequate infrastructure to regulate effectively in place already, and really kind of where we need to focus going forward. So I think in that regard, I think it's very much welcome, but with the caveat that it really needs to be a commission that is focused on not just doing the really good and important work that they're going to be set out to do, but that it's really a commission designed to help policymakers actually move forward on getting AI policy and governance right.
Okay. Laurie, back to you for a second. We've talked a bit about national security, and we can raise that again in a few moments. But you also raised another issue, which was this idea of explainability and transparency. And I think to the layperson, certainly to myself, the idea of transparency and explainability seems very attractive. What are the concerns about explainability?
So when I first came to Google after I was served in the Obama administration along with Bruce, and when I first came to Google in 2017, one of the first things that I worked on was putting a team together to develop Google's AI principles. And it was an amazing exercise, actually, because it was a time when our engineers were really wanted in a deep way to understand what the company's North Star was going to be in the development of this technology. And we put together a team of experts that was cross-functional and really debated for months. Googlers knew we were coming out with the principles, and they kept asking, when are they coming, when are they coming? And we kept debating, and finally we released them in 2018. And they've stood the test of time in an important way. But one of the principles and one of the key notions that we debated and thought a lot about at the time was explainability. But it was sort of an article of faith that, like, you should be able to actually understand the outputs and be able to trace through any system that you build. And now it no longer really seems possible in the same way. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, okay, so what were we trying to get at, and why does it feel like it matters? Well, it's really about transparency and accountability, and and safety. And how can we get at that in other ways? I mean, using the pharma metaphor and thinking about, you don't always know why a compound of drugs works, but you know how to test it for safety. And there's a bunch of practices that have built over time there. That may be the space that we find ourselves in when it comes to explainability. So I think the underpinnings of the notion of explainability are incredibly important, but I think we have to think about it in new and different ways, given the awesome potential of large language models to create really important outputs that we may not be able to perfectly explain.
And is that in your conversations with people on the Hill, is that something that's palatable, the idea that you're creating technologies that you can't actually fully explain?
I think we're all understanding as much as we can exactly how to think about these technologies, and we're talking about lots of different ways of creating accountability around them. And so one thing that my team does is adversarial testing. And we really try to understand how a model is going to perform before it's live. And to make sure that we sort of are overly conservative at Google. When Bard was released, we were, I guess, praised or criticized, depending on how you read it, for being sort of boring. We felt good about that because we don't want to experiment on the public in ways that really could cause real-world harm. And we've learned how to tune and calibrate over time and try to make it a little more interesting and open up to more creative uses, which actually do trade off against some of the parameters that we put in place in the first place.
Okay, thank you. Bruce, to bring it back to national security, obviously this is something which is core to what Intel is doing and to the way that you're perceived these days in America, in China, everywhere. When you think about regulation of national security, has it got to a point that it's becoming disruptive to innovation, or are companies finding ways to kind of work through the boundaries?
So it depends on the industry, but the semiconductor industry is a very good example. Pretty much every leading semiconductor company, and us among it, but if you look at NVIDIA, AMD, Qualcomm, TI, whoever, at least 30% of their revenue is in China. I mean, China is the biggest market in the world, and it's going to grow bigger. It's 30% of the global market right now. It's projected to be 40% by 2030. And so being able to be successful in China, if you want to be a global leading company, particularly because we're competing against companies like TSMC from Taiwan, Samsung from Korea, and foreign countries in other spaces, so we've got to be able to be competitive in that marketplace. And I will say, we've communicated to the administration, we absolutely support national security. We believe that, particularly for technologies that have dual uses, that's important. They've got to be regulated. But, in the category of where Jake Sullivan has said we should have a small garden and a high wall, our point is keep the garden as small as possible. Whatever the administration does, it has to be completely tailored, narrowly tailored focused on national security, and understanding what the impact is going to be when they do it. And there have been examples where I will say, where they've probably gone broader than those principles. The garden keeps getting bigger and bigger. And that is something that presents a real challenge to the global leadership of U.S. companies. I'll give you an example where you saw Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, who I'm not sure I've ever seen Jensen communicate or publicly on a public policy issue. It's a company that's been very quiet in Washington. And Jensen was out publicly basically saying, hey, if the administration takes these actions, we just became a $1 trillion company, but this will have a significant impact on our ability to be successful if the administration goes too far in the regulation of certain GPU chips. So we look at this and we really, we value national security, but we also have to do this in a way that doesn't undercut the ability of U.S. companies to be successful. And obviously, it varies by industry, right? The semiconductor industry is pretty unique to the extent that we're still the global leader in China and throughout the world. Obviously, with the Chinese economy being and the market being closed to some technologies, particularly U.S. search or social media, it's less of an issue there. But to keep the semiconductor industry as global leaders, we've got to be very careful in terms of how we regulate and how far we go, keeping that garden small, even as the wall stays high.
Chris, can I ask, underlying a few of the conversations today, we've already discussed regulation and what the future might hold. I guess, simply put, there's two very different broad models that are discussed. There's the Google preference for a hub and spoke model versus what others have talked about, kind of more of a centralized regulator. From your vantage point, what do you see as the ideal form of regulation?
I would say that what we need is expertise within government for the kind of regulatory infrastructure that we have in place to be able to manage the transition to an AI-driven economy effectively, right? Meaning that they're able to address fraud when it happens, they're able to address bias when it happens, they're able to address all the kinds of societal risks that we've, I think, we're all hopefully familiar with at this point. The question is how to get that kind of infrastructure in place. And I think I'm much more comfortable with something like a hub and spoke model where there's maybe a center of excellence or some kind of non-regulatory agency that's then liaising with all the regulatory agencies and providing them the expertise that they need to kind of make those kind of decisions and offer that kind of guidance. So I'm optimistic that we can get there on that front. I think what we probably don't need is a new regulatory agency with sweeping new powers to kind of regulate all of AI, which is going to put them in conflict with pretty much every other agency we have because AI is touching everything, right? Do you want a new regulatory agency on AI to now kind of adjudicate FDA decisions? I have some issues with the FDA. I wish they had more like AI kind of expertise in-house. There's a lot of room for improvement there. But I still would prefer the FDA than to have some new kind of AI body now touching health and touching banking and touching finance and having kind of overview over those things. And so I think a hub and spoke model where we're able to get the expertise into the agencies we have currently would be the best way to go. I mean, long term, I think what you really want is, I think we have 434 different agencies out in our government. We want all of them to be staffed, right? I think that's like the dream world. Whether we can get there, I'm a little bit skeptical in terms of like the workforce issues that would have to go into that. But I want to raise one point for why this is so important that we get the right expertise in-house. We were just talking about national security and kind of keeping the garden small and with a high wall, right? Sullivan's kind of famous phrase on this. They have started with semiconductors. They're now going to have, we're going to have some outbound investment screening soon for AI. The reason they're doing that is not to deny access to specific technologies. The reason they're doing that is to deny access to certain capabilities, which means eventually once they kind of get through the low-hanging fruit of these issues, they're probably going to start having discussions about what does an export licensing control regime look like for something like a large language model that's hosted in the United States but someone in China can access. Because if you're trying to deny them capabilities, that's kind of, and they can just get it by VPNing in, that's a huge issue for you as a national security policymaker. For the government, if they really want to go down that road, they are going to need an expert body within the government that is capable of defining what kinds of models they feel like need this special protection. which companies are able to are producing those models, and then which companies aren't, and also establish some form of deprecation mechanism. All of which is going to require a set of expertise in-house that I don't know that any of our existing regulatory infrastructure right now has. And so I think it's just one example of probably many of why this issue is so important, but it is something I think we can do.
Yeah, and let me just add in, I mean, having overseen an agency of 47,000 people with a huge breadth of different responsibilities, everything from NOAA to BIS, and it doesn't get much broader than that. But it is, I completely agree with you. If you start building a central function where it duplicates, overlaps, and potentially conflicts with what's being done in the functional agencies where there's already regulatory regimes, then it becomes a train wreck. Government doesn't work if you have duplication overlapping, and frankly, you don't, as a private sector stakeholder, it's very hard to deal because you don't know who the proper authority to go to. And we run into this in multiple ways already, and it only gets worse. And so, being able to, we're an industry where standard setting has been super important because at least you understand what the rules are and how people interact with each other. But I think from a government standpoint, making sure you do it. Now, the challenge, of course, is going to be getting the talent into government. We've seen this over and over. I'll give you an example. In our industry, we deal with BIS, who's great, but they've got, frankly, not the depth of the number of people who really understand these issues because it's hard for the government to recruit. We've seen this in the cybersecurity space. I mean, when I was at the Commerce Department, keeping cyber talent just from getting stolen away by other agencies, nevertheless, where they can go to the private sector and double and triple their salary. So figuring out how to build that expertise is going to require a huge amount of work because it's very hard. And if you have people in government who don't deeply understand these technologies, you end up with not great regulation.
So, to throw the question back, maybe at Chris, just because I suspect you might be more willing to go out on a limb. If expertise is not yet in government, and yet we have the outbound investment controls coming down the pike, are you concerned that it's going to be a problem, from day one?
Yeah, I'm concerned that there's the outbound investment screening that's going to be challenging for a whole set of issues in terms of, many startups pivot over time, right? So kind of narrowly defining what kind of investments you are and aren't allowed to make within the AI sector is going to be very challenging given the way that startups kind of maneuver. But the bigger issue to me is we have if you're treating some of these issues as a national security concern, we have an infrastructure in place for that for physical hardware, right? Physical tooling and machines. We have a little bit less of it for software. We don't really have it for AI. And if they want to build that, and if they really want to move in the direction of implementing that, they're going to have to bring in a lot of expertise that they don't really have right now. Or they're going to have to interface in a really robust way with the companies producing these technologies. I'm assuming that they will also do that, but they're going to need some form of internal kind of capacity to be able to do it.
Can I make one point on the outbound that's really important, which is, look, this originally started out as a way to limit venture capital funds from investing in Chinese technology. Now, ironically, the market has already taken care of that to the extent that the FDI, even from the VC world, has gone down particularly. And if that's what their goal is, that's much easier to achieve. Where it would be dangerous, and frankly, we have not gotten total clarity on what they're trying to do, is if they then start telling companies how they can invest their money internally, so not externally, not a company going investing in some Chinese startup company, but they say, hey, Intel, we don't want you moving money and doing things in China with how you run your business, and that becomes actually much more concerning to the extent that the U.S. government trying to limit how companies run their businesses becomes a lot more concerning. We've already got an export control regime that's significant and sets a lot of rules already. And so it's one of the things we're watching closely because there has not been clarity yet as to how broad the application will be of this.
Okay.
Just real
Laurie,
quick.
sorry, just to bring you back into the discussion about the expertise in government, what's your sense? Clearly there's not enough expertise in government, but based on your interlocutors now, do you feel like the government's going up the learning curve quickly enough?
I was at a small group session with a few representatives from European governments, academia, civil society, and an array of tech companies a couple of weeks ago, thinking about issues of democracy and AI and the intersection. And one thing that the group agreed on is don't count out the curve and how fast our representatives and that people in agencies and in the US at the state level are coming up it right now. The fervor of attention here is very real. And yes, you need to be able to find the right mechanisms to leverage deep technical expertise and understand in like very deep ways exactly what the dimensions and properties are of models when it comes to very specific forms of regulation. I think we're gonna find a way of figuring that out. Looking at the cyber context, which you raised, I think it's sometimes important to say, all right, are we in a completely new space, or are there some lessons to pull from an experience we've had in the digital space over the last couple of decades? And cyber is a really good one to look at. And so you're starting to see much more conversation, both about and norms established with public-private partnership and how we share information and key leads and act quickly when something is happening. And there's a lot of voluntary agreements within the cyberspace that keep the public safe, but also really intentional investments in pipeline, and Google will have more to share on that soon. But we are thinking and talking a lot about how to develop the right critical expertise so that people at all different seats at the table really have a lot to bring to the conversation.
One open-close dimension that we've not had in previous panels is that there's supposed to be room for you in the audience to ask questions. So if anybody has a question, we have a few minutes now. Please feel free to raise your hand. Anybody has a question for anybody on the panel?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Chris with the Chamber of Digital Commerce. I was curious if you have at Google thought about how blockchain interacts and overlaps with accountability, transparency from using NFTs and being able to determine provenance for all the different applications to use.
So I've been in a few conversations where the sort of deep adherence to the blockchain, like underpinning philosophy, have wanted to collide right now with the discussions that we're having. I don't want to speak in a lot of detail about where we are in our thinking on provenance yet, except that we are very, very deep in thinking about what the right set of technical solutions are. At Google I/O, we announced that we are committed to watermarking, and we're developing first-party solutions that we hope are going to be durable, tamper-proof, to the extent that that's possible, and also scalable to the ecosystem. Just to pivot quickly into one important dimension of open and close when it comes to questions of provenance is right now companies are having to figure out what is the best way for us to actually develop signifiers of when content has been generated, and what is the best way for companies like ours that also defend platforms for us to be able to recognize the broad array of other solutions that are out there. And so we're looking at lots and lots of different solutions. I think you can expect us to take a layered approach here. We know in a very deep way that badness doesn't start and stop on our own platforms, and so we need to be thinking ecosystem-wide when it comes to solutions. But we also want to make sure that we are sort of deeply invested in the right technical set of capabilities. So we'll be leveraging lots of different disciplines as we do that.
It seems to me there's often a narrative of like, oh, open source is good, big tech bad. On the flip side though, especially for AI, which can be weaponized, a lot of the groups are saying, oh, we need open source large language models. They actually are proposing democratizing potentially a weapon, right? All of the misuse and the criminal use of AI that people are worried about, they're not actually going to be using GPT-4 or BARD, they're going to be using the open source equivalent. How do some of you guys think government should kind of tackle that aspect when there's not going to be actually a legal entity they can target to regulate when it's their technology that will actually be used for all of these nefarious purposes?
While they're deliberating who answers, can you briefly say who you are and where you're from?
Yeah, my name's Andrew. I'm the CTO of a small startup here in DC focused on AI governance called Trustable.
I want Chris to answer because he said that we should do this, but he didn't say exactly how it would happen. So
I would say this is one of the areas I'm most worried about. There's when it comes to national security concerns with large language models and whether they're closed or open. There's two concerns. One is kind of that a competitor like China will get access to it. The other is that you've now got a powerful dual-use technology that could be available to non-state actors, to malicious groups of all kinds. What I would say is there are an array of, we've got a whole regulatory infrastructure focused on use cases and outcomes, right? There are models like Llama. I know that that's kind of the leading one, and all the variants on that. There will be others as well, undoubtedly in the future. Those in themselves, they need to get on a server somewhere to actually kind of create damage. That server, that cloud provider, probably should have a know your customer law, right? If you're worried about it producing and helping somebody produce new compounds that might be dangerous or new chemicals that might be dangerous, we have an array of firms and a whole industry that's built up to kind of take the description of a certain molecule and then manufacture it. Those folks need to have really intensive know your customer laws, as well as entire databases of potentially toxic. There's a whole field called computational toxicology that's dedicated to this, right? And what I'm saying, the reason I'm bringing all this up is I don't think we need to throw out the baby with the bathwater for this one particular use case. It is a concern. We absolutely need to invest in making sure that that concern is addressed. But I think we've got actually a pretty robust set of regulatory mechanisms in place to deal with the use cases and concerns that we're most worried about. Again, I don't want to try and dismiss it like it's a real issue, but I don't think the sky is falling on when it comes to this. I don't think it's quite as new as some other folks who have been really kind of forward-leaning in terms of how they're describing the severity of the risk associated with this. There's a lot that keeps me up at night around AI. That is not actually one of them.
And the only thing I would add really briefly is, to the extent we can use technology as a solution for some of the problems as well. For example, we've developed a deepfake detection tool that's got a huge, is a great accuracy. And so to the extent that we can find technological solutions to help address some of the problems that are created, I think will be very valuable as well.
Going to take two more questions.
Thanks very much. I'm Jeff Alexander with the Research Triangle Institute. So in the openness versus closed debate, there's also the open data versus proprietary data angle. And one thing about large language models, generative AI, it feeds off of learned training data. And proprietary data tends to be much higher quality than open data. But we have this potential problem of then companies essentially vertically integrating, right? That AI companies will just acquire more and more data and close it off to other people's access. I'm kind of curious, because I lived through the 1990s and digital copyright. Does our intellectual property framework need significant reworking to deal with the potential competitive and also national security aspects of people basically firewalling off data and using that to get greater capability?
Chris, I'm looking to you for this.
I mean, I'm happy to address it with the caveat that I'm not a lawyer. And so some of the copyright issues, some of the data privacy issues are not ones that I'm able to speak to in terms of profound legal depth. I will say the way that I think about some of the data privacy issues as it relates to AI is, there are concerns related to centralization of kind of large databases. I am also excited about the flip side of there's a lot of opportunity around privacy-preserving machine learning, whether it's federated machine learning, homomorphic encryption, et cetera, where we are able to get models that are nearly as performant as those that don't use privacy-preserving machine learning, with the benefit of not actually seeing the underlying data. And so I think that there's ways in which we're able to capture the benefits of AI at a technical level without having to worry as much about the data privacy issue. That's not to say that there aren't kind of a whole host of issues from a business model perspective in terms of how these are developed. I don't come at this necessarily from a business, I'm as interested as a casual observer on kind of which business models work best, if it's kind of vertical or horizontal. But the bigger issue in my view is we can get to a good outcome with AI by virtue of some of the investments we've made. I think we need to do a lot more of them from a policy perspective, which is what I spend a lot of my time on in terms of investing in more privacy-preserving machine learning capabilities. But it's an important issue, but it's one I think we've got a good foundation to build on.
There was a question at the table back there.
Hi, my name is Ryan Nabil. I work as the Director of Technology Policy at the National Taxpayers Union Foundation. I think one of the rather interesting aspects that was mentioned earlier was essentially the differences in legal systems between the US and Europe. I think in a European context, I think it makes a lot of sense to have a civil law-based approach in which you decide, okay, these are the regulations, we're going to mathematically determine all the things that could go wrong and have the policies accordingly. But in a common law-based jurisdiction, such as the US and the UK, I think what makes much more sense is the approach that the UK is taking, in which one has some principles for AI, and then one kind of lets the regulators figure it out. Now, one tool that I have advocated in my comments to the UK government has been that creating regulatory sandboxes for different sectors kind of allow people to figure out, well, this is how AI is going to affect this particular sector, maybe in this other sector it's going to affect it differently. To what extent do you think creating a regulatory sandbox in the US, perhaps different ones, and allowing different companies to participate in it and the government to supervise them and calibrate AI rules accordingly, to what extent do you think that would also be a suitable strategy in the US as well?
To add to that question, because we'll make this the last question of the panel, I think one of the things that's implicit in that is that we're heading to a world where it looks like we will have potentially quite substantially different regulatory regimes. One of the things that's often talked about, whether at the G7 or the OECD, is the idea of the benefits of having more harmonized regulation. Taking on board that suggestion for sandboxes, what is the risk of moving to a fragmented regulatory world? Will that hold back what we're able to do with AI innovation? Do you want to start, Laurie?
Yeah, I think Bruce touched on this a little bit earlier in his comments, and with sort of the state of affairs as we find them today is that Europe is moving very fast, and that the U.S. is also deeply invested in arriving at solutions, but I think without as much of a clear path ahead in terms of what form that will take right now. And China is moving very, very fast, and in fact, lots of jurisdictions around the world to be able to compete robustly. And it's a really interesting moment to find ourselves in when you think about the time dimension of healthy policy making and how much unknown there still is about exactly what form, open versus closed, democratized or centralized, the actual applications of technology will take. I think implicit in your question was the notion that we do need to be thinking on an application-specific basis and really testing and understanding exactly how, what uses are going to manifest, where we need to be worried and where we don't need to be. As Kent said, let's not worry as much about what gives you better search results, but let's worry more about some other types of applications. So I think it's good in these types of conversations for us to start to arrive at a core set of properties that, whether it's a set of standards or norms or regulatory regimes, will reflect back, and then also just acknowledge where some of the unknowns are and the flexibility that we may need to maintain, both to innovate and to compete, but also to regulate well.
I guess Laurie's comments were fantastic on this. The one thing I would add on the sandbox side is I think sandboxes are going to be absolutely crucial when it comes to what, I know frontier AI is a term that's been kind of floating around this conversation so far, the kind of leading edge advanced models and the training of those models, pre-deployment. We need companies that are developing these to feel safe testing them. Right now, there's kind of actually a perverse incentive of if you test this and you get data and it's showing that it's biased in some way or that there might be some harmful outcome that you're not aware of, you're actually disincentivized from running those tests because you don't want to know what the answer is, because as soon as you have that knowledge, you might be liable for any kind of damage it produces post-deployment. I think we actually want to create some sandboxes for them so we have the right kind of incentive structure for firms to invest at the frontier of the technology in a way that's compliant with our regulatory regime and doesn't kind of create, again, these disincentives from even testing them at all. We've seen that, frankly, as just one kind of side example of why this is so important. Part of the reason you don't have a lot of disclosures around kind of testing of, say, recommender systems in social media, which we kind of went through over the last few years. One of the reasons is there's a kind of liability in terms of the more you know about the model. If it's legally discoverable, you've got a real problem on your hands if you've got data that you're not comfortable with. And I think we want to eliminate, obviously we want to make sure that these things are being used safely and used well, but we want to create incentives for the developers of these technologies to make sure that they feel comfortable testing them appropriately, and that they've got, again, adjacent to that, they'd have to have the kind of right regulatory infrastructure that they could, if they did discover something, that they could kind of work with regulators on what the right approach to take would be, without fear of it interfering with their business or further innovation.
Great. Thank you very much.